Welcome into the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT, also streaming live this morning on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. We have got a great new report this morning out of the John Locke Foundation, reforming North Carolina's General Assembly. This is all ahead of what is likely to be a very lengthy, long session as we turn the calendar over to 2025. We've got two guests on the News Hour this morning, Jim Sterling and Andy Jackson, both with the John Locke Foundation, the authors of those reports, joining us this morning. Guys, appreciate the time. Let's start off, Jim, here on the first bullet point here, term limits, but we're not talking about congressional term limits or people running for office. We're specifically talking about leadership. Give us some insight as to what you wrote about that.
So there's been a large push since the 90s on congressional term limits, but this idea behind legislative one has also been in existence. Give you some context on this. This is a long-held idea that's been around since as long as the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, where they had various discussions of should they and could they implement term limits for leadership. This idea is currently presented in 14 different states, about 19 different chambers, with most of them being based on tradition and or chamber rules, the majority of those being chamber rules. Only one state has a statute in place, that being Maine, for its House and Senate. But it's a good idea to be able to implement since we've had leaderships that have been in there for decades and more. In order to be able to kind of refresh these ideas and get in new ideas, new leadership, new concepts, you need a fresh face on it. And that's kind of the core to it. We've had good timing on this as well, especially with the House seeing a leadership change and the North Carolina with Destin Hall now going in. And there's the high potential of Berger not sticking around for more than the current limits we're talking about, that being somewhere around 8 years. A lot of this has to do in North Carolina is because of, one, how strong our legislature is. We don't have co-equal branches. We have different branches that are separate and distinct in their powers. They, in the legislative branch, have certain executive authorities, such as appointments, which is one of the controversies that are currently going on in North Carolina. So we're looking at this and saying that we should implement these executive term limits that we have in North Carolina, which is 8 years, and implement those in for the legislative leadership.
Andy, so we're going to ask the House and Senate leadership to bring forward bills to potentially push them out of a job. That's always been the discussion up at Washington, D.C. Talk a little bit more about this, the something like this going forward and the importance here in North Carolina.
Well, it's going to be difficult. I don't think anybody's imagining that this would be an easy ask to ask essentially leaders to put limits on how long they can serve in their positions. There's a couple of important facets to this, however. One is, unlike kind of traditional term limits where you're limiting how long people can serve, this is not a restriction on voters' choices. Voters are still going to be able to pick the same person over and over again if that's what they want to do. This is a restriction on how power is distributed within the General Assembly. As it is currently, you have a couple of leaders, and once they're able to get in those positions, particularly the heads of the House and the Senate in the General Assembly, but also some committee chairs as well. Once they're able to get in there, they're able to gain, hold, expand power, and it gets really difficult. When we talked to some legislators, there was one who confided in us that pretty much things will roll in the General Assembly once leadership decides they should roll. And as a consequence, sometimes when you get these personal conflicts going on between the head of the Senate and the head of the House, it makes it difficult for the General Assembly to get their business done because of what is sometimes amounts to personal animosity or disagreement among the leadership. So having this kind of refresh button on the General Assembly leadership would help the body be more democratic in the sense that you're going to have a wider variety of legislators actually able to put significant input into bills and how they progress.
Well, and Jim, following up on that, you would assume if you just magically popped up in North Carolina today and you saw that the Republicans led both the House and the Senate, you would assume that they work hand in glove on everything. And while there is a lot of work that gets done, there's a lot of disagreements, and presumably we'll see a lot of that coming up in the long session. It always shows up with the biennium budget.
Right. So there is definitely a difference in leadership style and policy in the North Carolina House and Senate. We typically see the Senate being a little bit more fiscally conservative on various issues, and the House being slightly more, uh, for lack of a better term, they're not as staunch conservatives on the fiscal matters as the Senate is. So we see a bit of different policy decisions that come out of them. With what we're looking for on this is a bit of a change on the leadership, but like Andy said, it's not removing people or limiting voter choice. It's just regarding who's in charge of the chamber, which is a very powerful position. They determine what the composition is going to look like for various committees. They also help appoint for the leadership roles, such as the Senate Rules Chair or the House Rules Chair. It is very much a stylistic sort of thing. Though those positions are determined by the caucuses, leadership can definitely have an influence on that. So this would be a big change up for that matter.
Well, and Jim, I'm glad you brought up both the House and Senate Rules Committee, as you know, a lot of that stuff goes on behind the scenes. They don't meet in the General Assembly chamber. They typically meet in a different room, but pretty much everything that we see come to the floor has to pass through both of those committees in either chamber. Is that the case?
Yes. Uh, Everything has to go through rules. It's just that simple. It's part of the rules of the legislature. You have to go through rules. You have to go to the floor, and you have to pass both chambers on these rules. There's a couple of exceptions for the governor's input on vetoes, but that's the process of any bill.
A very interesting conversation. We'll continue it with Andy Jackson and Jim Sterling coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. And welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We are discussing a new white paper out from the John Locke Foundation this morning, Reforming North Carolina's General Assembly. We've got Andy Jackson and Jim Sterling, the author of that report, joining us here this morning on the News Hour. Transparency, Andy. When you tie that in with government, that is always a good thing. You've got some recommendations for the General Assembly as they head into their long session in January on increasing that transparency, which has been an issue now for quite a couple of years.
It has been. Yeah, it is true. Generally speaking, it's better that if you can have more transparency in government. One of my favorite mugs has a little slogan: "Privacy is for people, transparency is for government." And I think that really applies here because the General Assembly, as the most powerful branch in North Carolina in particular, but all government, really needs to be open to so that people know what's going on with their tax money, with their votes. What are they getting from government that they're putting these efforts into? And so this has been an area where we've actually seen a bit of backtracking from the General Assembly. They had a bill passed as actually a section of the budget that was passed in 2023 that included a measure that allowed members of the General Assembly to decide which records are public records that come out of their office. So essentially, anything that they did not want to make public, they could decide not to make that public. And they said this was to resolve some conflict with the government with, I forget the name of the organization. It was like the state library or something like that, about which documents were going to be put into kind of receivership for public consumption later. But they could have made a more narrowly crafted section of the budget that would have dealt with that. But they did a very broad sweep that essentially allowed them to put anything under cover that they wanted to make. And this was probably so that they could have a lot of discussion among themselves, whatever documents they wanted to share among themselves, on redistricting, because that was the next thing coming up. We had another round of redistricting coming up just on the tail end of that budget being passed. So a necessary first step for North Carolina would be to repeal or modify that so that we'd have at least a broader input on what is a public record and what is not, rather than just each member deciding for themselves. And I think we should really go a step further and have a constitutional amendment for transparency in North Carolina. It would have a couple of elements to it. One, it would apply to all three branches. For the General Assembly, it would require a supermajority to carve out any exceptions. Now, in North Carolina, where we have supermajorities almost as often as not, that might not be a super large impediment, but it will make it a little more difficult, at least, to carve out exceptions to transparency rules. And another one is that we have what is called a clearly outweighing standard. And what that means is, and this would be really on dealing with when this gets to court cases, it would say, unless there is a clear reason to not have transparency. So, for example, if you have constituents' personal information, like their phone number, their name, and that sort of stuff, that you may want to keep private, except for those kind of narrow exceptions, there's a presumption of transparency. And I think those kind of things would help make the General Assembly, once again, more responsive to the people, because the people will know what's going on. It's hard to be responsive when people don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, no question about that. Jim, they often say where there's smoke, there's probably a fire. Is this the case of that information truly is trying to be obstructed by the General Assembly? We've heard claims in the past that there's too much paperwork involved, there's not enough staff to deal with this. Assess that situation for us. Is this something that's super important for the General Assembly, and more particularly for voters as they head to the ballot box every 2 years to elect their members of the GA?
So I think a lot of this has to do with the lawfare. There's a lot of legal cases before the General Assembly, usually more partisan in nature. One side's angry about a certain bill or a certain issue, and they want to take it to the courts to try to throw it out. We've seen this through constitutional amendments. We've seen this a lot through redistricting. We've seen this in basically every law that was not favorable to one political party over the other. They want it tossed out by the courts. I think they overdid this when they did the transparency law to try to prevent from them having this kind of search for anything in your emails or anything that's available to be able to use in the courtroom. And that's kind of why this is a more nuanced stance that we put together on this matter for personal information and all those details. But unfortunately, for a lot of the General Assembly, even though there is a huge amount of lawfare, you still have a duty of transparency to your constituents and to the people of North Carolina, and that needs to be still clear. I think there's a number of reporters that have complained about this matter, and I fairly side with them on that. There needs to be some answers from the elected officials and those who are accountable to the people of North Carolina.
Andy, I want to touch on Jim's point there. A couple of reporters have made these requests. I would assume 99.9999 repeating percent of people will never submit a public records request with the North Carolina General Assembly. There's a relatively small group of people that will do this. Do you think that the issue with this transparency is because, frankly, people just don't know that it's even an issue? It's something that they should even care about?
Well, and yes, that is true. Most folks are not going to be making public records requests because people have day jobs, people have families, people have church. They're not spending every waking hour. As a practical matter, transparency is something that is going to be for journalists, and yes, for lawyers, perhaps for lawfare, and for people from various activist groups, including the John Locke Foundation, that may be interested in what's going on in government. I, for example, regularly submit public records requests to the North Carolina State Board of Elections. But you got to remember, in our system, those groups, those activist groups, and reporters are kind of the tip of the spear for the public. They're the ones kind of rooting out the information and getting that. And then from there, it gets out to the public. So it's not really a case of that we need to have transparency so that everybody can get in and get out that information. It's so that the information can become available to the people. And yes, there are indirect conduits to the people. usually through these groups or through reporters. I also want to point out that the General Assembly, on a lot of scores, is not completely awful on transparency. When bills start coming up, once they're submitted by legislators, they're up on the web page. There's debate. That process is fairly open. North Carolina actually scores, middle to high range on a lot of transparency scores compared to other states. So we're not trying to change things wholesale here. We're just trying to fix very specific problems, and we think our proposals will do that.
Real quick, Jim, we heard from Andy about the idea that this would go for a constitutional amendment, just like what we were talking about earlier with term limits. That would require the General Assembly to pass legislation to put it on a ballot, correct?
Well, with term limits, that could be passed on the ballot, or it could be how other states do it. You could also do it by statute. So it's a little bit more nuanced than that. You can do it a couple different ways, as many states do. But for this, we would recommend a constitutional amendment. I don't think there's any other way it should be done, because this is something that if you leave into the practice of the general statute, that's limited in general statute or the rules of the chamber, it can be changed any time in any way, depending on who's in charge. So this is something that needs to be more concrete.
We'll continue.
And I am glad that Andy did.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I am glad that Andy did point out that we do score pretty well in transparency. A lot of this is this has been started because of an issue that it ended up in 2023. Just resetting it back to how it was a good way to do it. It's kind of our recommendation.
We'll talk about session length and pay with Jim Sterling and Andy Jackson coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. You can take the show on the go with you if you're not up bright and early every morning at 5 a.m. by checking out the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast in your favorite podcast apps. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour or visit WBT.com and hover over the podcast tab. We continue our conversation this morning with Andy Jackson and Jim Sterling of the John Locke Foundation about a new white paper out ahead of the January long session for the General Assembly. It's aptly named the long session, Andy. Legislators are supposed to be done around the summertime, but we've seen that these long sessions can go to the point where members are decorating their offices with Christmas trees and wreaths. You've got some comments on session lengths. Take it away, Andy.
Yeah, and it's a little unfortunate that it has come to that. Now, traditionally in North Carolina, the General Assembly is not only the most powerful body in North Carolina, it's also the body that's closest to the people. Legislators, they come from their home districts. At least traditionally, they spent most of their time back in their home districts, seeing the people in their hometowns and in their communities, and then they go back to Raleigh. But unfortunately, session lengths have gotten longer, a little more irregular, and it's more difficult for them to get back into their local communities. And we've seen this in the numbers. Traditionally, over a biennium, every 2 years, we have the long session and the short session together. We have about less than 200 legislative days over the course of 300 calendar days. Legislative day is the day they're actually in session. And so what that means is for the long session, they'll spend X number of days over the course of, say, 5 months. And then the short session will be hopefully much shorter than that. And combined, that adds up to 200 days over the course of 2 years. And unfortunately, we've had kind of mission creep over the last decade. Initially, when Republicans took over after the 2010 election, they were able to keep these things fairly short, but almost every year they've been getting a little bit higher, a little bit higher. It kind of reached its height in the 2021-2022 biennium, where we had 246 legislative days over 475 calendar days. And so we actually had a session that went into the next year. And these kinds of sessions there are a drain on legislators, especially junior legislators, who are often have families, have careers that they're trying to maintain back home. It's harder for them to keep their regular jobs going if they don't know when or how long they're going to be in session. And even if they did know, with these extra long sessions that we're getting, it's hard for them to have lives. Remember, these are supposed to be part-time legislators and careers, and B, actually spend a decent amount of time back in their home districts with their constituents. And so these things combined make it really difficult for people to serve effectively as legislators unless you have an independent source of income or you're retired.
Yeah, no question about that. We'll talk about that pay in a second. We see states like Florida, Andy, where they have a pretty hard limit on their legislature. I think it's something like 60 or 80 days, so they've got to get in and get out with their business. Is this a situation where government doing less in even a shorter amount of time is better, or does that create another problem where you've got legislators that maybe have to rush through legislation that isn't fully fleshed out because they are running up against such a tight timeline, Andy? It seems like there's kind of pros and cons with both of those.
Yeah, there definitely is. And so we are not seeking like a maximum short, make it as short as possible. We are trying to thread the needle with this proposal. What we would like to do is, for regular sessions, have a June 30th deadline for both the long session and the short session. The short session tends to start later on in early spring, where the long session generally starts in late January, early February. And so we would have kind of a hard stop for regular session on June 30th. Now, that date is not picked randomly. The new fiscal year starts July 1st. So June 30th is the time when the General Assembly should pass a budget. Now, you would still have an ability to have extra sessions for particular events, like, for example, state emergencies, like we saw with Helene, or veto overrides, or if there's a court case that demands immediate attention from the General Assembly, like we sometimes have with redistricting cases where the General Assembly has to come back immediately and draw districts. So there will be reasons, but there'll be particular reasons, and the General Assembly would meet to address those particular issues and then go back out of session so the members of the General Assembly can get back to their districts. And we have to remember also that these sessions are not free. There was an estimate, and this was done back in 2015, that each day the General Assembly is in session costs taxpayers an additional $50,000. And that was before our recent inflationary period. It's much higher now. And so that kind of cost, that is a direct cost to the taxpayers whenever we unnecessarily extend these sessions. So the General Assembly has shown that it can do its job with shorter sessions. It can deal effectively with the governor, for example, with shorter sessions. It just has to have the will to do it. And a lot of times these long sessions, getting back to the leadership issues, are not really due to conflicts with the governor. They're due to conflicts between leadership in the House and the Senate. And so putting both of those sides on a timer might help force them to resolve those conflicts.
Jim, as we were listening to Andy and his thoughts, he, of course, mentioned the idea that especially for these younger representatives that are likely still in their working prime, still building on a career, trying to live their lives, the pay situation. I'm sure many folks would be surprised to learn that North Carolina legislators make less than $14,000 a year, but that's actually the case. Jim, talk a little bit about the pay and what needs to change, in your mind, change on that regard.
So just to give some context on this, the pay hasn't changed since 1995. That is quite a ways. That's nearly 30 years at this point. With how everything's moving on, the situation, it does not even cover or adjust well when we start considering the inflationary differences. So with $14,000, they're having to be in session for very long times with no idea of how long the session is going to be. That's kind of why we marry these recommendations when it comes to session length limits as well as pay increases. The problem is not just the pay, however. There is also issues with reimbursement rates for mileage and per diem. Per diem is set at $104, where the standard for Raleigh is about $125. So not a huge amount of difference, but that's still amount of money that's coming out of members' pockets when they're also not able to work unless they have a job that has very unstrict time requirements that are involved, or they can work from home or on travel. That's the only way you can really afford to do this if you are still working, unless you're retired or have some other kind of flexibility with your job. But while the per diem is an impact, there's also a mileage impact. While we haven't increased the pay since 1995, we haven't increased the mileage since 1993. And most states marry this to the federal rate, which is set at 67, is about 69 cents on there, whereas they're still paid about 29 cents roughly. So wear and tear on your vehicle, you're losing money on costs. And when we compare to other states on the income level of this, they're well and truly behind. I mean, the average on this is around 34,000 for hybrid states that are just like them. For the median on this, I should say, not the average. But they're not really able to really do this unless you have a very specific job or you're independently very wealthy. It's a difficult job to do, and it limits the number of people they can serve. We should try to address that.
Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Thanks for spending some time with us on this Thursday morning. We continue to track details out of Washington, D.C. in regards to hurricane relief. U.S. Senators Thom Tillis and Ted Budd, both Republicans, they both represent us here in the state of North Carolina, joined several other senators in sending a letter pushing for a vote on disaster relief. The letter reads as follows, quote, "The Office of Management and Budget's request for $98 billion in supplemental disaster appropriations is an important first step towards securing the assistance our community needs. Major urban centers such as Asheville, North Carolina, only received steady access to portable drinking water on November the 18th, and major thoroughfares of commerce like Interstate 40 remain impassable and have sustained significant damage. Our constituents need immediate help as they work to rebuild their homes and communities. We've delayed too long already. We therefore request that Congress act immediately to provide those in need. We stand ready to pass a supplemental disaster relief bill by the first week of December. We, of course, are in that first week of December now as that lame duck session does continue in Congress. We will continue to track those details as you can imagine Senators Tillis and Budd actively and continually urging for that additional hurricane relief to help those folks in Western North Carolina that are still recovering from the impacts and devastation left by Hurricane Helene. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Continuing our conversation this morning with Andy Jackson and Jim Sterling from the John Locke Foundation. Jim, let me ask you this. I've often heard the claim that, well, because these individuals are making less than $14,000 a year, which is less than half of the median income in North Carolina, that nobody is getting rich getting into politics. And you'll hear various members of the House and Senate joke from time to time that I didn't go to Raleigh to get rich. How do you balance that with not turning this into a career? We hear the term all the time, career politicians, individuals that run for these positions and essentially live their livelihoods off of it. How do you balance those two things, paying them a realistic amount of money to get the very important work done for the state, but at the same time not making it into a career that you're in for 40 or 50 years and getting rich off the taxpayer?
Well, it's an important point, and frankly, it's the same reason we're looking at this and session limits in the same way. You can't do too much and you can't do too little. You got to find the Goldilocks, the right in the middle, the perfect point on this. So we think that going with the average salary of about 34,000, meeting the median on where other states are, is about right. It still is less than the average income, which is about 37 according to census. for North Carolina, it's still a reasonable salary. It's still a lot of time. They still need to maintain a job outside of that, but it makes it so it's available to people who aren't in those high income professions like lawyers or consultants for various insurance industries, anything like that, or retired. You need to be able to have people in there that understand various parts of the economy. They understand various job sectors to be able to have that kind of professionalism and understanding of various parts of industry. If you only have a couple people from very specific niche markets, you don't really have too many experts on that subject matter that are representing the body in North Carolina.
It's a great point. And Andy, let's just assume somebody's working a 9-to-5 job in the IT sector or some other various sector. They want to go become a legislator. I mean, it's just not practical if you have a traditional 9-to-5 job. Even if you have a little bit of flexibility in your hours, you're talking about being up in Raleigh for days, weeks at a time when things really get going. It creates definitely an issue. It seems like probably in that 30 to maybe 50-year-old range when you're in the prime, your prime time for employment and making as much money as you can at a traditional job. Kind of cuts a lot of that out unless, like Jim mentioned, you're a lawyer or a consultant or somebody that's got a huge amount of flexibility with your schedule.
All right. And let's look at an example. If you are, say, a junior legislator from the Charlotte area, for example, or Gastonia, somewhere around there, you're coming in, you're getting the base pay is around, a little over $13,000 a year. You're not covering your expenses at home with that. When you travel here, you're only getting 29 cents on the mile, which obviously, with gas the way it is today, and certainly with wear and tear on your vehicle, that is a losing proposition for folks that have to travel any reasonable, distance from Raleigh. And on top of that, once you get here, you have a per diem that, if you're willing to find the cheapest place and eat, sustain yourself on nothing, Taco Bell and the cheap menu at Burger King, then yeah, maybe you can get by with that. So these three things in tandem make it especially difficult for legislators that aren't within an easy commute of Raleigh to conduct their business. So we think that you can reasonably increase the pay without making this a career. People that want to live well are still going to have other jobs. But if you combine this with a reasonable reduction in session length with a reasonable but not excessive increase in pay, I think you're going to strike a better balance so that legislators can work their day jobs, if you will, and be able to be effective legislators while still being able to get back to their communities and learn about the interests of their people and better serve the interests of their people. So taking these two parts of our report especially should be taken in tandem in order to help legislators be better public servants.
Yeah, no question about that, and especially getting back to your district and hearing from the individuals that you're representing and being able to fight for their interests up in Raleigh, obviously a huge part of that job. Jim Sterling, Andy Jackson, appreciate the time this morning. You can read more on their report by visiting johnlocke.org. That's John, LOCKE.org.